If you want to get better at JavaScript, build stuff. So in this video, we're going to build an event calendar like this with vanilla JavaScript without the help of any libraries or frameworks or anything like that. And we're going to pull in live event data from a headless CMS called Storyblok. What's up, everyone? My name is James Q. Quick, and I do weekly videos on web development related topics. And I'm a huge fan of JavaScript, and I love to help other developers get better at JavaScript. So this is going to be a beginner tutorial where we're going to build an event calendar. We're going to build a calendar from scratch with just vanilla JavaScript, just kind of hack it together as a fun exercise. And we're going to pull in live data using a regular fetch request that's built into JavaScript to pull in data from our source, which is Storyblok. Now, if you want the source code for this, I'll have a GitHub repo link in the description below, so you can go and check out all the source code. You can follow along, do exactly what I'm doing. And at the end of this video, I'll give you some additional challenges that you can take on by yourself to force yourself to practice and continue to learn. So you're not just following along with me, but you're learning how to build on your own. That's the #1 way to get better at anything. Now, this video is sponsored by Storyblok, which is one of my favorite headless CMS options. I've done a few different videos with Storyblok, and they're pretty amazing, and I think you'll agree with this. So everything that we'll do in this video is on the free tier of Storyblok. It's not a paid thing. You can go and try it out yourself. And if you do, let me know what you think in the comments below. With all of that said, let's go ahead and get started. All right, so the first thing we'll do is get you set up inside of your Storyblok account. This is free. Again, the link for Storyblok is in the description below. I've already signed up before, so after you go through the sign up and then login process, you get to a space where you're going to create spaces for your content. So in this case, we're going to create a new space, and we'll call this our event calendar. And we're just going to start from scratch. We'll create all the stuff ourselves. And notice that I chose US. That's where I'm based. And this is, again, free. It says trial. That's fine. We can continue with the free version of this, the community plan, forever. So don't worry about that. So eventually, we'll come back here and start to actually create data. This is what's known as a headless CMS. If you're not familiar with this, a content management system. And so the benefit of this is we have the ability to create content in here in a way that's very intuitive and then bring that into our applications, which is what we'll see here in a little bit. So let's actually go over to our code. And I've got just a basic HTML file, CSS, and JavaScript file. So actually, if you create a new HTML file and do exclamation and enter, you'll get this exact same information, except for the links that I added for the JavaScript file and then the CSS file, and then I updated the title to JavaScript event calendar. Now, as we're working on this, one of my favorite things is to use the live server extension. If you search live server in here, you can click on this and install. And what this does is it gives you a button down here that says go live or run with live server. And this will open up the application inside of the browser. And as we add stuff in here, so if we add an H1 with the text events, we'll see that show up here. So this is actually really, really nice. It's my favorite way to just do basic HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. So let's start with a few basic styles. These are kind of going to be like reset things just to kind of set the tone for the application. It's not much. We're going to set the font family to sans serif. This is a little more modern than a serif. And then we'll set the box sizing to border box. This means that if you give something a width, it's going to include the padding inside of that, for example. And then we'll also have, we'll set the color to be white for all of our text. Then inside of our body, we're doing just a reset here of margin 0, padding 0. And then we'll also set the background color to this fun kind of dark blue. So it's 312E81. All right, so now we should see that we have that. We have our events in here. And the other thing I want to do is add a container. So usually containers are used to kind of center things on the screen and give padding on the outside. So this is almost the default stuff I use in every one of these demos. So inside of here, we'll have a little bit of padding. We'll use the margin 0 auto trick. So this is going to move, if we tell it to take up, which we will do, a width of 1200 pixels. If the screen is wider than that, margin 0 auto is going to automatically kind of shift the content to the middle, which is what we want. Now we're also going to use a display of flex. This is CSS Flexbox, which helps you kind of position things either horizontally or vertically. And actually, in this case, we're going to change the direction of this to be column. I'll show you what changes if we don't do that in a second. So what we need to do is actually use this container class. So I'm going to wrap the events h1 in a container or a div with a class of container. Little shortcut here is you can use emit snippets to do that. So dot container, you can see generates that for me. So I can surround events here. And if I do a second thing just for testing of like calendar, we can see what this looks like. So notice that it's taking up a width of 1200 if we come in and do this. So the width of this is 1200, and then you have this margin on the outside. So that's the margin 0 auto to center this stuff. And then these things are stacked on top of each other, events and calendar. If we were to take Flexbox and remove the flex direction, by default, it's row. So notice it's stacking these things. Actually, it's not stacking, it's aligning them, putting them all in the same row. So in this case, we want to actually stack them. And the last thing we'll do is do align items center. And so what we're trying to do there is center this content on the cross axis, in this case, which is centered horizontally. So since we tell it to be column, now the cross axis is going to be horizontal, and align items is how we position things on the cross axis. All right, so that's our base kind of styling in here. In the HTML, we're not going to have that much. We're going to have another section here for header. So this is going to be a div with a class of header. Again, dot header. You can type this out, but I encourage you to learn emit snippets. So we'll have header. Inside of there, we'll have our text for events. We're also going to have buttons to go to previous and next months. So we'll come back to that, but we'll just make sure we have this header already marked. And then we want a div with an ID of calendar. So to do this, you can just do hashtag and then calendar, and that's going to generate a div with an ID of calendar. And that's basically all we need in here. We're going to come back and add these forward and backwards buttons. We are then also going to dynamically generate all the days and stuff for the calendar inside of JavaScript, which is a lot of fun. So let's go ahead and start to do that. So we're going to create a function, draw blank calendar. And basically what we're going to do is, if we look at this original version of this, we're going to now create 35 different boxes. So 7 across and 5 down. We're going to create a blank box for each one of those and add on the label for the day. So that's what we want to do. And we're just doing this in JavaScript because it's going to be, in my mind, a little bit easier, although you could absolutely do this in your HTML as well. I think it's just a fun exercise in JavaScript. So we're going to iterate through for loop. We're going to start with let I equals 0, I less than 35 again, and then I plus plus. All right, and then what do we want to do in here? Well, we want to create the elements for each one of these blocks. So each block here is a div with a class of day. And then inside of it, it has an element for the day text, the day number, and then what we'll get to is the event name if there's an event on that day. So we're going to create each of these with JavaScript. So we're going to say our day is going to be document.create. So this is how we create elements in JavaScript. And we're going to create a div in here. And then we want to add a class to this. So we'll say div.classlist or day.classlist.add. So this is how we add classes in JavaScript. So we'll have that one. We'll then have, very similarly, we'll have a day text. So create element, and this will just be a p tag. We will add a class to that. So add this class of day text. We will also have the day number. So we'll create an element for that, create element. And this will be a p tag as well. We'll also add day number, a class list, add. We'll call this day number. Notice I'm using hyphens and all lowercase in here. That's more of the convention for classes in CSS and HTML that you'll see. And then lastly, we'll have an event name. So this will be document.create element. And this will be, we'll list this as a small element because this is going to be a little smaller than the rest of the text. And then we'll do the exact same thing. We'll access the class list. We'll add a class of event name. So one thing we haven't done is actually call this function. So let's call draw blank calendar. And you may expect things to show up, but nothing's there. And the reason is we've created these elements, but we haven't actually attached them to the DOM. So what we need to do is take these elements and then add them to our actual calendar. So I've got a little snippet in here called get ID, and I'll show you what this does in a second. What this does is it creates a snippet that calls document.getElementById. If you remember, we have the ID of calendar in here. So we're querying this div element by its ID. We get a reference to it. And now we want to take the day and append that to our calendar. So there's an append child function. And to our calendar, we want to add in the day. Now, the other thing we didn't do is we want to add the day text, day number, and event name all to that day as well. So for the day, we will call append child. And I'm going to do something that will be a little tricky. So let's actually show you one of these. So we'll do day text. And I'm going to show you a fancy way to do, I don't know what's called, a fancy way to do multiple cursors. So I'm going to click a cursor here. I'm going to click a cursor here. And the second option, or the second way to click that cursor, to get the second cursor is to hold down Option and click on Mac. And I guess that would be Alt on Windows. And then I can select both of these, copy them, and now I can come down and say day.append. Actually, I need to get a second cursor here. All right, and then call day.append child. And then since I have two things copied to my clipboard, it's going to paste both of them in appropriately. So we add those elements to each day. If you didn't get that, that's okay, the cursor stuff. But it's fun to work with. I encourage you to try them. We're going to add those things to the day, and then we're going to add the day to the calendar. So we don't actually see anything because we don't have any styles, but inside of the body, hopefully, we have a calendar in here that does have nothing in it. So we need to actually check what is going on in here. So let's make sure we're calling the right function. It looks like we are. And we can log out a day object in here just to kind of see if we're getting that correctly. So let's go to the console. Looks like it's logging 1. And then it looks like maybe we're not accessing the calendar correctly. So we're able to create the day, but when we try to reference this calendar, it's not finding it. So let's make sure in the HTML that this ID matches up with what we have here. And it does, but I think we're missing one core thing, which is that the JavaScript should be loaded after all of the DOM elements. I often go back and kind of put them in the wrong position, but this is a good learning experience of the script tag should go after these elements are loaded. Otherwise, it won't have access to those elements. So let's save this. We shouldn't see much here, although we see the log. And then if we go inside of our events and go down to in the container, in the calendar, and then you see all of our day classes. So now we can start to do some of our basic styling with our days. All right, so let's start with our calendar. So our ID of calendar, and we're going to use in this case a display of grid. So with our grid, we can define rows and columns, and we can actually have them like automatically wrap. So we're going to say this is a display of grid. Then we'll use grid template columns, and what we want to do is we want to define this thing is going to have 7 equal columns. So you could say 100 pixels, 100 pixels, 100 pixels for each one. But there's also a repeat function. And so we want to repeat 7 times with a pixel width of 150 pixels in this case. And then we'll see, I'll show you gap here in a second. So that is our calendar. That should now be laying these things out. If you look at this, they're now laid out horizontally until they wrap and come down to a new row. So that looks good. And then now we need to start to style the actual day objects. And the main thing we want to do here is give a width and a height. Actually, those are individual things. So 150 pixels and then a height of 150 pixels. We'll add a little bit of padding. So 10 pixels for padding. And let's do our background color, background dash color of 6366F1. All right, so at least we'll be able to see these now. And notice these are all basically just look like a solid block, so we can't tell the difference between them. So one of the things that we can do is add a gap in grid. So we can give this a gap of 3 pixels or something. And basically this is going to create space in between each element, which is really cool. And then I also want to add a little bit of border radius to this to round the edges just a tad. So you'll see this rounds them just a tad, but it's starting to look pretty good. Now, the other thing we did is add a hover effect. So if you take day and then add the hover pseudo selector, we can change the background color. We can change this to a slightly different blue. So 4F4 6E5. And so as we go, we'll see it change colors, which is great. The other thing that we'll do is add a transition of 250 milliseconds on all property. So this will just make that not like kind of fade in or change colors with an effect, transition effect, instead of just automatically becoming that thing. All right, so that is looking pretty good. Now our next thing is to start to actually update the calendar. And so we're gonna have an update calendar function, update calendar, and we're updating this by month. So what we need to know is the month, the year, and then eventually we'll get to the events that we display on here, but not yet. So we want to query for all of the day elements. So all of the ones that are inside of the document. So we'll do a document query selector all with a class of day. So all those elements that we just created, each time we update this calendar, we're going to get a reference to each one. Now I want to get a reference to the first of the month, and I'm going to call this the first and just call new date. But when we create a new date, it doesn't give you the first of the month. It gives you like right now, the time and day of right now. So to change this, we can say the first and say set month. And then we want to set it to the month that we're getting inside of here. All right, that parameter. And then we'll do the same thing for a year. So whatever that parameter is that we are getting for both the month and the year, we want to get the first day of that month in that year, if that makes sense. And now we're going to use that to kind of iterate through the days inside of our grid and update them accordingly. All right. So the other thing we want is the first day of week. So we want to know like basically what day of the week does the first fall on. And so this will be, we'll take the first and we'll call get day. So this gets the day of the week. Cool. And then now we also want to be able to display what the month and the day are. So I'm going to copy in 2 arrays here. So one for months and one for days, so that we don't have to type all of these manually. Again, you can go and get this in the source code. But here's an array of all the months and an array of all the days. And so if we scroll back down, we want to now get a reference to the month name by calling our months array and passing in the month that we're in. Again, the parameter comes in here. So we say, hey, update the calendar for this month. And then we go and get the text for that. And then we can create a piece of text called month with year. And this is going to be a combined year and then month, I guess. Year and month. Now this is using the template literal syntax for a string. So this is a way to concatenate variables inside of a string. So use the backticks and then use the $ and brackets to be able to use the actual variables inside of that. Now, one of the last things we want is the days in month. So we want to know how many days are in this month. And this was a little bit of a, I guess it's not a hack, but it's something I found out. So if you create a new date with a day of 0, it'll actually, so if you create a new date with a month and a day of 0, it'll actually give you the last day of the previous month, if that makes sense. So we'll create a new date with year. We'll increment it to next month, but with a day of 0, which will give us the last day of this month. And then we'll call get date. So that's how many days are in this month. So let's start a for loop, and we'll start with a day counter, and we'll start this at 1. Actually, we may not even need the day counter. I think we can actually get rid of this and just use our I. So let's actually write our for loop. So we'll say for let I equals, starts at 0. It's going to be less than day elements dot length. So we're iterating through each one of those elements, and then we're doing I plus plus. We can get a reference to that day from the day elements array, and then with the index of I. And then inside of each of these elements, remember, they have their own property, or they have their own elements inside. So they have day text, day number, and event name. So we can get a reference to those. We can say that the day text is going to be our day, and then we can call query selector on it, and we're looking for something with the class of day text. So just a way to get a reference to the text element that's inside of the day. And then we can take our day text, and we can set the inner text property, inner text, and we can set this to days of I mod 7. So let's actually stick with days of I. So let's go ahead and call this function so we can start to test this out. So let's call update calendar. And hopefully what we'll see, we start to see that the first week has the days correctly, but it's not after. And this is because we are incrementing I above the length of the array. So we want to wrap this down and mod it by 7, which means if it becomes 8, it will round it back down to 0. So now you can see we have our Sunday, Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, Saturday, and that is displaying correctly, which is great. Now, next up is we can get a reference to the day number. So we also want to update the number of the day. Also, you could refactor this to put the day text in here, which would probably make sense. Let's go ahead and do that. So it should actually work when we draw the blank calendar, because those day names are not going to change. So let's actually take this up here. And when we do the day name, let's just do this. And that should work as well. So let's comment this out and just make sure that still looks good. So Sunday through Saturday for each week. Cool. That way we're only doing that part once. But now we want to get the day number. So we can, again, query selector from our day, and we want to get a reference to the day number. That's a text element that we want to update. So we want to make sure if we're going to add in a number, we don't want to add in numbers that are not in this month. So we only want to add the number text if it's the actual day in this month. So we can have an if condition to say if I is greater than or equal to the first day of week. So remember, we got the first day of week up there. So we want to make sure we're greater than or equal to that. And I is still less than the days in month. So those are our two conditions to make sure that are met. So then we can take our day number, and we can set the inner text property to I. So we can go and look at what this is showing, and it's not showing anything. And I realized that we didn't actually call the blank calendar, or excuse me, the update calendar with the month and the year that we want to be working with. So now it has no idea. So what we'll do is we'll start with creating a variable at the top. We'll call a new date, call it today. So we'll create the new date, and then we'll get the month and the year. So we'll say current month equals, and this will be from today, we'll call get month. And then for the current day or current year, we'll do today.get full year. And then when we call the update calendar originally, we want to pass in the month and year. All right, let's see if we get something. Now, let's see, month is not defined. That's because these are current month and year. So current month and current year. All right, so now we actually see the numbers coming through, and it looks a little odd because it's starting at 3 and it's going to 27. And this is actually where we need that day counter that I mentioned earlier. So I thought we could get rid of it, and maybe we could do something interesting, how to put this together in a different way. But I say we just go ahead and add this variable. So what I mean is we are, before this for loop, we're going to create a day counter, and we're going to start it at 1. And then we're going to increment this every time we find a legitimate day, so one that we care about. So that's going to be inside of here. We're going to call day counter plus plus. And then we want to set the inner text in here to the day counter. So this way we're separating out, iterating through each item from the actual days that get displayed. So you can see we start at 1, which is great. We then end at 25, which is a little short. So we want to double check our conditions here. So I think what we want is inside of our condition, we want to check the day counter. So as long as the day counter is less than the total days in the month, we should get almost all the way up. But one more thing, we want this to be less than or equal to. So in this condition, we'll check less than or equal to the days in the month. And now we should have, for February, we have 1 through 28. So those days are coming through, which is exactly what we want. Now, when we get into actually updating the months, the dates will change. So we kind of want to reset. If it's not a day in this month, we want to reset the inner text of day number. So inner text to be nothing. We want to get rid of that. All right. So this should be kind of the basics of our calendar. Now we can go into our CSS and we can style the day number a little bit to be a little bigger, basically. So we'll say day number, say font size is 42 pixels. We can say the font weight is bold. We'll text align center. All right, and that should be a little bit bigger. Now, the one thing that is interesting is this is taking up a lot of space. So we can set the margin to be 0. And that actually looks pretty good in there. There was another thing I was going to do with aligning this using a fancy CSS grid property, but I think that isn't necessary in this case because just doing that kind of takes care of it. So this is working for us. Now, the next thing we can do is work on changing months. So to change our months, we're going to add 2 buttons in our HTML. And I'm going to just copy these in because they're going to be fairly straightforward. But inside of our HTML file, we're going to add into our header 2 more things. So we still have our H1 with an ID of month, which will get updated. I can't remember if we updated that appropriately or not. It looks like we didn't. So let's go and make sure of that. So let's go into our JavaScript and we query. We aren't querying the month yet. So we get a reference to the month with year, but we don't actually use that. So we can do our get ID. This is a snippet again that I have. We can query that month. And I'm going to call this month L for month element. And then down here, we're going to update month L.inner text with month with year. All right. And this should actually be month name instead of month. So now we should see that displayed 2023 for February. That's good. And now let's go back and look at these buttons. So these buttons just have left and right arrows. We are calling functions for previous month and next month. So we need to go and create those functions. And hopefully you can, or maybe take a second and pause and think about how are those buttons going to relate to the update calendar function, or how are we going to leverage those? So let's create our functions for previous month and next month. All right. So what will next month do? Well, when we change the month, we need to call update calendar. And then we have these variables for current month and current year, but we need to change this to the next month. So what we can do is increment current month first before then calling this. So this should work, I believe. So let's call the next one is here. So that's March, the days update, which is great. We can go through and through and through. So that looks good. The other thing that we could do is we could just add this plus plus in here, but this won't quite have a perfect outcome, because what this will do is actually pass this variable and then after it will increment it. So you'll see one click won't do anything, the second click will. So instead we could prefix this with plus plus so that it does the plus plus before then incrementing. So one click now will do it, which is what we want. And then you can imagine the opposite of this for previous month is we just do minus minus. So we want to go the other way. So in this case, we can go forward, backwards, but then we hit a problem of switching years. And this is where we need to add a little bit of logic in here to handle this. This would be a good challenge for you, a relatively simple one if you want to pause this and kind of take a guess at how to solve this, and then come back and I'll show you how to do it. So for the previous month, the thing we want to check is if it is a month of 0, we then want to subtract a year as well. So if it's a month of 0 and we subtract 1, we want to go back to 12 and then set the month to subtract 1. So what we can do is we can say that exact same condition. If the current month equals 0 and we press previous, set the current month to 12, set the current year to subtract from itself, and then come in and update, keep this exact same call, but then update current month. So current month is 0-based indexing, so 12 gets subtracted down to 11, which represents the 12th month. And then similarly with the next month, if it's 11, we will set the current month to -1. That looks weird, but that means then when we increment it, it will come up to 0, and then we increment the year. So now we should have this like pretty good looking calendar that is able to iterate through months and years. Now notice these things are kind of jumping around. We actually need to add some styling to these. So we put all of those inside of a header class so that we could be able to style them together. So we want these to kind of be in line with each other. We want these arrows to sit next to our text. So we can use display of flex for this. We did this earlier, but now you see it sets them side by side. But in this case, instead of having them stretch out or vertically, we can say align items is center. So this is going to align all of these items in these across the main axis vertically. We can also give this a gap of 20 pixels to spread them out a little bit. So that looks good. And then one of the things we'll notice is this is going to kind of shift the width a little bit, which we don't want. So we can set the width specifically to 400 pixels. All right, so we still see this shift. So the thing that we can do is we can spread out these elements, the buttons and the text, across all of the open space that we have. So to do this, we can say our justify content is space between. So this is going to spread those out, take up all the space, and now that text and the buttons stay in the exact same spot the whole time, which is pretty neat. So there is also a little bit of styling for the buttons. Just getting rid of the background, getting rid of the border, adding a cursor pointer, font size, a transition, and then to scale them up to make them look a little bigger. So we hover, it scales, and these buttons work the exact same way. So we have our calendar now. The next thing we want to do is actually connect this to Storyblok so that we can display the events inside of this calendar, and it's live data coming all the way from Storyblok. So let's go into our Storyblok here. And inside of content, we want to create a new folder. So we want to create a folder for all of our events. And Storyblok kind of thinks of content in relation to it being on your website, because that's kind of the point of this, is it's going to be on your website. So you'll see things like slug, which is basically the URL for this. And so we're saying all of our stuff is going to be inside of an events folder. Now, before we can put events in here, we can say we're going to create a new story. That's kind of what one of these individual pieces of content are. We're going to create our first event. So we'll call this meetup 1 or something. This is going in the parents directory. And then we want to add a new content type. So the content type of this is going to be an event. That's going to be the name of it. All right. So let's actually go back and go into our block library. This is where we kind of define what the different content types are that we have. So see, there's event here, but it doesn't have any properties associated with it. So we can add a text property. So here's all the different types that you can add. There's a lot of different things in here. We can add a title of this. We can add a link if we wanted to. So a link to the actual event. And then lastly, we can add the time. So we can add a date time in here. So there's our date time. We'll go ahead and add that. And those are the 3 different properties that we want. So again, creating content inside of Storyblok is very, very easy to work with. And then we can pull this data in using just a basic fetch request in our application. So inside of events, we should have one event already. So this is meetup one. Notice now that we defined what what events look like, what sort of properties they have, that we have this over here. Trying to make this a little bit bigger. So we can call this my first meetup. We can have this be an external link, and I'm just going to link to my website for now. And then we can choose a time. So when is this first meetup? Well, we can say this is on Thursday, the 16th at a specific time. Apply, publish this, and that record is out there. Now we can go back and we can create another event. So let's create a new story. And this will be wins of the week. This is actually something we do inside of my Discord where we celebrate everybody's wins every week. So we can create a wins of the week. We can call this wins of the week 1. We can have this be an external link, so URL to the Learn, Build, Teach website. And then the time of this, they're on Fridays. And specifically at 9 a.m. Central. So that's my time zone. That's where these events are. We can go ahead and publish this just to prove out that we have 2 events of stuff that we can work with. So go into a meetup, and then I've got my wins of the week session coming up. So one of the things we'll need, I think it's under getting started, is an access token here. So an access token, this is read only. This is what we're going to include in our request to Storyblok to be able to get the data that we're looking for and then be able to work with it. So inside of here, we'll go back to our JavaScript file. And at the top of our file, I'm going to paste in a variable for, let's do it right in here, for the Storyblok URL. Now you can figure out what this URL is. It's pretty standard up until kind of this point. And the one thing that's specific in the US is if your instance is deployed in the US, you have -US. Otherwise, you don't need it. And so we're looking to query stories, and then we're looking for stories that start with events. So they're in the events folder. And then we need to paste in our token. So this is the old token. So just replace that with your token that is specific to this space. So this is the URL that we're going to make requests to. Now it's worth noting that Storyblok has NPM packages for different libraries and frameworks. So if you're using React or SvelteKit or something like that, they have SDKs to make this easier for you. This is just a fun exercise in my mind to do this with vanilla JavaScript. So without the help of SDKs, to show you that it's still really, really easy. So let's go down, and we're going to create a new function for load events. So this is going to be an async function, and we're going to make a fetch request inside of here. So we're going to call fetch, and we're going to pass in the Storyblok URL. This is returning to us a promise, which means we need to await that to get the response. And then from there, we're going to get back data by taking the response and then converting that to JSON. So we want to get back the JSON response, and then we can log out data just to see what this looks like. So the last thing we need to do is call the load events function at the same time. So we'll call load events, we'll go into the console, and we should see that we have an object come back with a property called stories, and inside of stories, there's our 2 pieces of content that we care about. So with this, one thing we can do to get access to that stories variable is just destructure it directly. So this is the equivalent of doing this. So if we got data and then we said stories equals data.stories, that would be the exact same thing as just doing this. And I just think this is a little bit simpler. So we'll get access to these stories, and then we need to have some way to associate as we go through each of these stories. How do we know if it matches the day that we're looking at when we create our calendar for that month, or when we update our calendar for that month? So this may be a little bit complicated, but I want a quick way to figure out whether or not the day of the story, or whether or not we have an event for each day as we iterate through and update the calendar. So to do this, we're going to transform this stories data, And we're going to build up what we can kind of call a map. It's not a specific map inside of JavaScript because they have a different thing for that. But objects in JavaScript are key value pairs, and we can search to see if an object has a key value pair by the key, which we're going to use as the date time. So maybe a little complicated. Let's actually go ahead and walk through this. So we're going to say our events is going to come from our stories array, and we're going to call reduce. Now stick with me. Reduce is a function that takes in a callback function, and that callback function takes in two parameters, the accumulator and then the individual event that we're iterating through. And then the second parameter is what is the data that we're going to start with. So we're going to start with an empty object, and then for each object, we want to add a key value pair where the key is the date without time, so just the day, and then the value is the actual content of the event itself, if that makes sense. So we can start with the event time, and we can create a new date from event.content.time. So those properties that we created are on the content property of the event. And then we can say the event date is going to be a new date, and we can say event date event time dot to date string. So basically what we've done here is we've created a date from the time of the event, and then we convert that to a date that is date string format, which gets rid of the time. So this is just this event date now only includes month, day, and year. So if we actually log this out, we should see each one of these. So you see this is Friday, February 17th, 2023, but then the hours, minutes, and seconds are all set to zeros, which is what we want. So when we have that string, now we're going to take our accumulator and we're going to set the event date as a key, and the value is going to be event.content. Lastly, we're going to return that. And instead of setting this to a local variable, I'm going to create a global variable for events. So I'm going to create a variable up here, just say let events, and that will get updated when we actually load those events. So at the end of this, let's log out events just to see what this looks like. So this is an object where you have the two keys, which are those dates without the time. And then inside of here, you see the actual content of that event. So the link, the time, the title, etc. All right, so that is working well. Now, when we update our calendar, we want to know if for the given date that we're on, if there is an event that matches that. So let's scroll down to, actually we were in the right place. So to our update calendar function. And remember we said we were going to pass in the events. So we want to pass in the events here. The problem is these events haven't actually been loaded yet. So what we'll do is we will make sure they're loaded by creating a load function. This is going to be an async function. And we're going to await load events. So we'll make sure that all those events are loaded. Then we'll draw the blank calendar. Then we'll update the calendar with the events. And then lastly, we'll call load down here. So everything should still work the exact same, but now we should have access to our events inside of the update calendar function. Now, the other thing we'll need to do is also update the next and previous to pass in events as well. All right, so those will get passed in. Now we need to add the logic in here to decide if there is an event for a specific day. So to do that, we need to get a representation of the day that we are currently iterating through in the same format as those keys that we mentioned earlier. So to do that, we can create a variable called this date. So the one we're currently working on, and we'll say this is a new date. And I think we can pass in the day, month, year. So if we pass in day counter, the month, and then the year, let's log this out and see if that is what we think it is. So this should log out a bunch of these, and it looks like it's almost right, but not quite. So it looks like the day on here, or the year, we're passing in the wrong order. So maybe it's year, month, and then day counter. All right, so that looks right. So we're iterating through each one of these. Notice the time in here is 0, so that should match what the keys are in our events object that we just formatted. So now we want to check if that exists. So we can say if events of this date, if there is one, now we want to get the event. So we'll say event equals events this date. All right, then we'll say the event name is, the element is the day query selector. So we're querying that event name. And then we can take our event name and set the inner text property to be. We could just set it to the event.title. I'm going to add just an asterisk or like a bullet point to this basically, and then add in the event.title. All right, so now if we go back, we should see that it is showing my first meetup and wins of the week, which is really nice. This is pulling live data from Storyblok. Now, one issue here is if we go to the next month, notice it still shows those same events. This means that we need to come down and do an else. So if there's not an event, we need to reset this back to nothing. So we will do that. So on February, where do we say event name dot intersect? Oh, this should be queried up here. So like this, like that, I believe. So we'll get that event name and then we'll update it regardless. So we'll see first meetup wins of the week, and then we'll do our next one and there's nothing there. Now to show that this is still live, let's go back to content. Let's go into events. Let's go create a new story. This is going to be inside of the events as well. We'll call this wins of the week March, for example, and we'll say this is going to be of type event. We'll create that. We'll call this wins of the week. We'll then choose a day in March. So March 9th, apply, publish this. Let's go back and refresh our calendar. So right now in March, it says nothing. If we refresh, we go back to February, meetups there. And then if we go in to March, now you see that it's loading all the data each time from Storyblok. So I just think this is a really cool exercise to practice your vanilla JavaScript, get comfortable with DOM elements, querying APIs, and then working with external data sources like Storyblok, which I think is a super, super common thing to do. I use headless CMSs for a lot of the projects that I work on. Again, big fan of Storyblok. Thank you to them for sponsoring, but they've got an awesome product, so I hope you enjoyed it. So let's talk really quickly about what could you do next? What are some of the things that you could do to kind of take this to the next level to add some additional features? Because this is not perfect. So one of the things that you could do is for these events, add like a sidebar of some sort. So you could see the details of the event. You can make this little piece of text clickable. You already have the link in the data in Storyblok. You can make this an anchor tag and actually click on that to be able to open it. Now, the other thing we don't have is the ability to do multiple events on one day. So this is tricky because we created that we converted the events into this key value pair thing where the key was the actual day. So what would you do if you had multiple on that day? Well, for that key, you could set the event date to an array, for example, that includes the content inside of it. But then you'd have to check in here if that key already exists. Instead of creating a new array, you add on to the array. So that would be a fun challenge that I think would be really good. Mention the sidebar idea. Again, you can make this come out all the way and create a sidebar to view the details of the events. You can make the calendar more responsive. So this is not responsive at all right now. If we just scroll down, we're just going to miss it. So how could you make this smaller? Could you add a week view? Could you toggle between the view of the week and the view of the month, example, or stuff like that? And then lastly, if you notice, let's do a slow internet connection. So if we go to network and throttling and do slow 3G, what we'll notice is this is going to not show anything basically until we load our data from Storyblok. So if you see in here, it's trying to load the data, it finally gets it. So one of the tiny things that we could do is when we actually do our loader, we could load events after the draw blank calendar. So that would at least show the blank calendar first. So we'll see blank calendar there. And then we'll load in the event. So that works. The annoying thing about that though is we don't have the actual numbers either. So an additional thing we could do is we could not call update calendar here, or we actually would call update calendar, but we could pass it an events thing of basically an empty object. And then when the events are loaded up here, so when we actually load all of these events and format them, we could call again update calendar and pass in current month, current year, and then events. I believe this will do what I think it will. So this should show all the numbers as well. Maybe not. Did it not do that? I think I forgot to move them. Yeah, so we should move update calendar up here. So we basically update calendar originally with no events to get everything on there. And then the events will pop up after the data loads. So that's a better experience. And you could also add like a custom loading icon to let people know that data is being loaded, etc. But at least it's a little better now. So hope you enjoyed this video, this tutorial. This is a longer one, but I think it's a really, really fun. Practice your JavaScript, get better at building stuff, exercise. Hope you enjoyed it. Let me know what other types of content you'd like to see in the future. Thanks as always for checking out the video, and I'll catch you next time.